The night was cold, the wind howling through the empty streets like a lost soul searching for warmth. Outside the grand iron gates of a sprawling mansion, a frail figure huddled against the bitter chill. His clothes were tattered, his hands shaking, and his eyes, though weary, held a silent plea. He had nothing left in this world. No home, no family, no one to turn to. But on this particular night, he had hope. Hope that the man who owned this mansion, the man whose name echoed through the city as one of the richest, most successful businessmen, might find it in his heart to offer him just a moment of kindness. Inside the mansion, the chandeliers sparkled like stars trapped in glass, and laughter echoed through the halls. Richard Langston sat comfortably in his enormous leather chair, sipping a glass of the finest whiskey money could buy. He was a man of power, a self-made millionaire who had clawed his way to the top, leaving behind anything or anyone who dared to slow him down. He believed that wealth defined a person, that those who had nothing were nothing, and in his world, kindness was a weakness. A sudden knock at the door disrupted his evening. His butler hesitated before approaching, casting a nervous glance toward his employer. Richard despised uninvited guests, and the way the knock echoed in the silence told him that whoever stood outside was not one of his wealthy acquaintances. With a sigh of irritation, he motioned for the butler to open the door. There, standing in the doorway, was the beggar. His face was lined with hardship, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. "Sir, please. I don't want money, just a place to stay for the night. It's freezing out here. I haven't eaten in days." Richard stared at him, disgust flashing in his eyes. He let out a cold chuckle, shaking his head. "You must be joking," he scoffed. "Do you have any idea whose house this is? Do you think I built all of this just to let some filthy beggar waltz in and make himself comfortable?" The beggar's eyes glistened with desperation, but he remained calm. "Sir, I was once like you," he said softly. "I had a home, a family. Life can change in an instant. All I ask is for a warm corner to rest, just for tonight." Richard's expression darkened. "Your sob story doesn't interest me," he said sharply. "People like you are poor because you're lazy, because you make bad choices. And frankly, I don't care." He turned to his security guards. "Get him out of here, now." Without another word, the guards grabbed the beggar's frail arms and dragged him down the marble steps. The old man didn't resist. He had expected this. The gates shut with a loud clang behind him, and Richard turned back into the warmth of his mansion, already forgetting the encounter. Outside, the beggar stood still for a moment, looking up at the towering house, its golden lights glowing against the dark sky. He sighed, wrapping his thin coat tighter around himself. As he shuffled away into the night, morning came. The mansion stood as grand as ever, untouched by the sorrow that had knocked on its doors the night before. Richard woke up feeling as powerful as always, completely indifferent to the previous night's events. But as he stepped into his lavish study, something felt off. His phone buzzed. It was his assistant, her voice shaking. "Sir, you need to check the news." Richard frowned, grabbing the remote. The giant TV on the wall flickered to life, and what he saw made his blood run. Cold, his mansion, his front gates, and the beggar. Only this time, the man wasn't standing. He was lying motionless on the frozen ground just outside Richard's property. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He stared, unable to look away as the reporter Zim spoke in urgent, somber tones. The beggar hadn't survived the night. Richard's hands clenched into fists as he stared at the screen. The news anchor's voice filled the room, each word hitting him like a weight pressing against his chest. This morning, the body of an unidentified homeless man was discovered just outside the Langston estate. Reports suggest he sought shelter from the freezing temperatures, but was turned away. Authorities are investigating the circumstances of his death. The image of the beggar, lifeless on the cold pavement, burned into Richard's mind. He felt something he wasn't used to, an unsettling twist in his stomach. Guilt? No, he had nothing to feel guilty for. It wasn't his fault. The man could have gone anywhere else. He had choices. That's what Richard kept telling himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling as the day went on. His usual routine, morning coffee, reading the stock market updates, checking emails, felt different. The mansion, once a symbol of his success, now felt eerie, empty. He caught his reflection in the glass of his office window. For the first time, he didn't see power. He saw something else. A knock at the door made him flinch. His butler entered, looking unusually nervous. "Sir, there's a detective here to see you." Richard stiffened. "Detective?" "Yes, sir. A Detective Harris. He has a few questions." Richard hesitated, but only for a moment. He had nothing to hide. He nodded. "Send him in." Detective Harris was a tall man with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He stepped inside, his presence carrying a weight that filled the room. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I assume you've heard about the man found outside your property." Richard leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression unreadable. "I saw the news," he said evenly. The detective nodded, watching him carefully. "Witnesses say he was here last night, that he knocked on your door, asking for shelter." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Detective, I own this house. I have the right to decide who comes in and who doesn't." The man was a stranger. I didn't know his intentions. "Of course," Harris replied, his tone neutral. "Do you remember what he said to you?" Richard hesitated. The words played. In his mind, "I was once like you. Life can change in an instant." A chill ran down his spine, but he pushed it away. "He asked for shelter," Richard admitted. "I told him no. That's not a crime, detective." Harris studied him for a long moment, then flipped open a small notebook. "Mr. Langston, do you believe in coincidences?" Richard frowned. "What are you getting at?" The detective tapped his pen against the notebook. "We identified the man this morning. His name was Henry Parker." He paused, letting the name settle. "Does that sound familiar?" Something flickered in Richard's mind. A memory, buried, deep. His grip on the armrests of his chair tightened. "No," he said quickly. Harris didn't break eye contact. "That's strange, because Henry Parker used to work for Langston Enterprises." Richard's breath hitched, but he masked it with a forced laugh. "I've employed thousands of people over the years. I can't possibly remember every name." Harris nodded slowly. "Understandable. But Henry Parker wasn't just any employee. 15 years ago, he was one of your top managers. Highly respected, hard-working. Then suddenly he was fired. A week later, his wife passed away. His life spiraled from there. Lost everything. Ended up on the streets." Richard's mouth went dry. He did remember. Barely. Back when he was climbing the corporate ladder, he had made ruthless decisions. Downsizing, cutting costs, replacing weak links with more ambitious employees. Henry Parker had been one of them. Richard hadn't thought twice about it back then. He was focused on winning, not on what happened to those left behind. "Detective," Harris continued, "Mr. Langston, don't you find it ironic? A man who once worked under you, who helped build your empire, ends up at your doorstep years later. only to be turned away. Richard felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. He forced himself to maintain his composure. I didn't know who he was. If I had... He stopped himself. What was he even saying? Would it have made a difference? The detective closed his notebook. I'm not here to accuse you of anything, Mr. Langston. But sometimes, life has a way of bringing things full circle. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Or maybe it's something more. Richard exhaled as Harris turned to leave. But before stepping out, the detective paused. By the way, the coroner's report mentioned something strange. Richard looked up. Strange? The autopsy showed no signs of existing illness or major organ failure. He wasn't just a sick old man who couldn't handle the cold. He was in relatively decent health for someone living on the streets. Harris tilted his head. It's almost as if something else took him. Like he simply gave up. The words lingered in the air long after the detective had left. That night, Richard found himself unable to sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying the events over and over. He needed to forget this. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his responsibility. Yet deep inside, something whispered otherwise. A soft knock echoed through the halls. Richard sat up, heart pounding. It was past midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? Slowly he got out of bed, his feet moving hesitantly across the cold floor. As he reached the front door, a sense of unease crawled up his spine. He placed his hand on the doorknob, paused. Then he opened it and froze. There, standing in the dim glow of the porch light, was Henry Parker. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded so hard, he could hear it in the silence. He blinked, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Henry Parker stood there, just beyond the doorway, his face calm but his eyes dark with something Richard couldn't explain. Impossible. This couldn't be real. He had seen the news. Henry Parker was dead. Richard stumbled back, gripping the doorframe to steady himself. This isn't possible, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Henry tilted his head, slightly, his expression unreadable. You don't remember me, do you? His voice was soft, but there was something unsettling about it. Richard forced himself to breathe. I do, he admitted. I don't understand. Henry took a step forward, but Richard instinctively stepped back. A gust of wind swept through the open doorway, carrying a biting chill. It smelled of winter, of something distant, yet familiar. You threw me out, Henry said simply. Twice. Richard swallowed hard. I didn't know who you were, he defended. If I had, Henry raised a hand, silencing him. Would it have made a difference? The question hung in the air, heavier than anything Richard had ever felt. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He didn't know. Maybe it wouldn't have mattered. Maybe Henry would have still been just another nameless face to him. Henry took another step forward, and Richard felt an overwhelming need to shut the door, to lock it, to make this all disappear. But something stopped him. Why are you here? Richard finally asked, his voice hoarse. Henry's lips twitched, almost like a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. To give you something you never gave me. Richard tensed. And what's that? A choice. A deep, unnatural silence settled between them. The world outside felt distant, the wind eerily still. Come with me, Henry said, extending a hand. Richard stared at it. A choice. That's what Henry was offering. But a choice for what? Richard's throat tightened. Where? Henry didn't answer. He didn't have to, because somehow Richard already knew. Memories flashed through his mind. the years of ruthless ambition, the people he had pushed aside, the lives he had changed without a second thought. And now, standing here, at this moment, he realized what Henry was showing him. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about understanding. Richard took a shaky breath. His entire life had been built on power, wealth, and control. But for the first time, none of it mattered. He looked at Henry, really looked at him. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, just quiet patience, as if he was waiting for Richard to finally see. Slowly, Richard reached out. His fingers brushed against Henry's hand, and suddenly, everything shifted. The mansion disappeared. The cold wind became harsher, the world around him blurring until he was no longer standing in the comfort of his grand home, but in the very place Henry had been the night before, outside, alone. The ground beneath him was frozen. His breath came out in visible puffs, his body trembling against the cruel night air. He looked down at himself. His expensive silk robe was gone, replaced by tattered, threadbare clothes. His feet were bare against the icy pavement. His hands shook uncontrollably. Panic surged through him. He turned, searching for his house. But it wasn't there. There was nothing. Just the endless cold, and the darkness stretching around him. He stumbled forward, his body weak, his knees buckling under the weight of exhaustion. His throat burned, his stomach ached. A new kind of fear settled deep inside him. The fear of having nothing. And then he saw something, a mansion in the distance, lights glowing warmly inside. Laughter echoing faintly through the air. His mansion. Relief washed over him as he staggered toward it. He reached the grand iron gates and pounded on them desperately. "Let me in!" he shouted. His voice was raw, unfamiliar. "Please, I need help." Silence. He pounded again. "Please, it's freezing out here. I can't." His voice cracked, his breath hitching. He tried again. "I live here. This is my house. Let me in." The doors remained closed. The warmth inside felt impossibly far away. Then a figure appeared. Through the glass doors, he saw himself, standing tall, dressed in a fine suit, holding a drink, laughing, completely oblivious to the man outside. His own voice rang out, clear and sharp. "I don't help beggars." Richard's chest tightened. He stumbled back, the reality of it crushing him. He was Henry Parker now, and no one was coming to save him. The cold seeped deeper into his bones, and for the first time, he understood not just Henry's story, but the weight of every person he had ever ignored. The air grew heavier, his vision blurring as his strength faded. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the frozen ground. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the warm glow of his home, so close, yet completely out of reach. Then, nothing. A sharp gasp tore through his lungs. Richard jolted upright, his heart hammering wildly. He was back in his bed, in his mansion. The warmth of the blankets wrapped around him, the morning light streaming through the windows. His breath came in ragged gasps as he touched his hands, his face, his chest. He was alive. He was here. Had it been a dream? A vision? A warning? He didn't know. But as he sat there, his body still trembling from the phantom chill of the night. Before, he did know one thing. He had been given something Henry Parker never had, a second chance. Without hesitation, he threw off the covers and rushed downstairs. His butler looked up in surprise as Richard grabbed his coat. "Sir, I have somewhere to be," Richard said breathlessly. The city streets stretched out before him, the morning air crisp, but no longer feeling so cold. For the first time in his life, Richard saw the people around him, the ones who walked with their heads down, the ones who clutched their thin jackets tightly, the ones who had nothing but each other. And then he saw them, the people like Henry, the ones he had ignored for years. Richard took a deep breath and stepped forward. This time he wouldn't look away.